Hello, Jax West from Stephen Avery Project, MAM Gossip, Justice with Jax. We were just live in our MAM Gossip group where we go over the Brendan Dassey jail calls. These are calls that somebody filed a Freedom of Information Act to get all of these calls, and then they sent them to me. And we've been playing them and discussing. And while I play the calls, I take notes. And then periodically, I come here on Stephen Avery Project, Hey Maz, and give you a brief review of the calls. So, hello, John. While I'm reading through my notes, I'm not necessarily looking at your comments, so I may not answer your questions. And the more people obviously that comment, the faster it scrolls. So don't think I'm ignoring you. It's because I'm not the best multitasker. And I don't know what the date was that the one that I'm starting on from my notes, how long ago this was. So, and also I have the worst writing. So I may not be able to read my own writing and need to think about it when I'm reading this. So this is just where I'm summarizing these calls because I realize not everybody has the time to listen to all of these calls because we've done, 50 plus hours of calls. So, or people don't have the desire to listen to them all, and I get it. So that's where this comes, so this is just a little summary, but if you want to hear them all for yourself, you have to join our MAM Gossip group. It is a closed group, and all the episodes we have done are in there, and you'll be able to listen to them for yourself and hear it for yourself. So this first call, so we're starting from the 15th file. Everything's in files and they don't have specific dates. Oh, and people from Gossip that's been with me, can you watch the people that are asking questions or whatever and answer their questions for them, since you've listened to all these calls and you all know the spiel. So since I'll be looking at my notes and not at their comments, so if y'all would answer them, that would be great. I appreciate it. Okay, so all these calls are put into files that then, China, it's been a long time, that there isn't particular dates on them. And as these went on, they seem to have been in order, and we were getting to where it was like October, and now all of a sudden the calls are back into March, when Brendan was first taken into custody. So it can be confusing at times, I get it, but it sucks that, we don't have specific dates on this stuff. So on this first one, I have in quotes on this call that I was on the phone. So I missed a lot of what was on this call, but then it just so happens that sometimes these calls were like uploaded more than once, the same exact call. So then we got it on another call, so then I was able to listen to later what I missed. But I'm only going to read my notes in order as we go, otherwise I'm never going to be able to keep track of it. So most of the calls, Brendan talks to his mom. That's really all Brendan really wants to talk to at this point is of China, is Barb and Travis, who was his best friend at the time. Travis, and I still need to do this one day. This is something that we've talked about in Gossip, that I need to, make a board of the relationships between people because it's so intertwined that it's hard to keep it all straight. So Travis's father is Robert Fabian. Robert Fabian was Earl's, so Stephen's brother Earl's friend. This is who was driving around in the golf cart with Earl on that day that Teresa Halbach went to the salvage yard. So that's Robert Fabian. Robert Fabian was married to Cindy. So Travis's mother is Cindy. Cindy's sister is Candy. Candy was married to Earl at this time. So then I know I could see how confusing this is just by me trying to say it all. So then Brendan's cousin Kayla, the one that when she had to take the stand, she took back everything she had said. So she's cousins with Travis. Okay? So I know. It's weird. China's roll calling all the Debbies. All right. So most of the calls are with his mom. And so what I have written here on this call after Barb's name is SSDD, which stands for same shit, different day. So because these calls, a lot of times it sometimes gets confusing where we're like, did we listen to this call already before? But they say the same things every call. So that's why I have same shit, different day written down there. Brendan talked about that he was guessing, because Barb is always questioning him on why did he say those things. And Brendan I was guessing. And he talks about, that he thought he was going to go back to class. And Barb tells, because Brendan really wants to get out on bond or bail, whatever. Is it the same thing? I don't even know if bond and bail are interchangeable. And so the thing that Brendan keeps obsessing on is if his grandfather would put up some property, would sell some property, because there's the salvage yard and then there's all this property they own up in Crivets. So would he sell or put up this property that then could pay for Brendan's bail? And so Barb tells him they won't take the property. It has to be a cash bail. So that was that call. Second call on this one is to his cousin Carla Chase, who I loathe. Carla Chase is a big, huge, whatever. I won't get into that because this is Stephen Avery Project where we don't get into that stuff. We can talk about that over in MAM Gossip. So he called Carla because he was looking for his mom and couldn't get a hold of his mom. Carla tells him that his mom is fishing. And Brendan said for her to tell his mom that she's got a block on her phone. And so he wasn't able to call her phone. Next call was to his mom. And she asks him, what time are you going to call Grandpa? So this is something we notice a lot in the calls that, so you have Brendan, who is a 16 going on 17-year-old boy with a low IQ, and he doesn't really have an understanding of the world, definitely not the situation that he's in. And his mom keeps putting everything on him to do for himself. Call your lawyer and do this. Call Grandpa and say that. And Brendan is very uncomfortable not wanting to do these things. It is clear that he doesn't have a good relationship with his grandfather. And he really wants his mom to be the one to call her dad to ask about putting up the money to get him out. But she keeps telling Brendan to do it. So she she asks Brendan, what time can you call Grandpa? And Brendan says, I don't know. He says he can't call in the morning because of school, because he is attending school while in jail. Um, Barb was with her mom. Dolores says that he should call around 5:30, and that's when he would be able to talk to his grandpa. Brendan asks his mom, you don't know what it's for, on why he should be calling Grandpa. And both Barb and Dolores say to him they don't know why he will be calling Grandpa. And Barb asks him what's going on, and Brendan said, for what? And Barb says, what do you mean you don't know? And then Barb said to him, who said you planned it? And Brendan said, me. And Barb says, and earmuffs if language bothers you. Barb says, is it fucking true? And Brendan says, no. Barb says, if not true, why are you saying it? Did they threaten you? Brendan said, no. They said, if I say, needs to be emphasized here. Brendan said, if I say what they want to hear, they will go easier on me. Brendan says, I don't know how to say it. Barb says, they put this shit in your head. Don't lie to me. Brendan says, I ain't. Brendan says, they said it. They want it coming out of my mouth. They said they already knew what happened, but they wanted me to say it. Barb says, how did you know it? Brendan said, guessing. Barb says, I would say lawyer before I talk. She said, you're going to be in prison for life. Brendan said, why didn't you tell me about the letter Brad sent out? And see, this again shows you how Brendan just really doesn't know the situation he's in, with how he will flip what the discussion is. Because, it's really intense right there with him saying they've told him to say these things. And then he's switching the subject to, why didn't you tell me that Brad's mailed me a letter? Barb says, because it slipped my mind. And she says, he's just making it look good for himself. Brendan said, he said he would do something to make me feel better. When he was in Manitowoc jail, he could get orders sent right away. So another thing that he is always obsessing about is he thinks that if he was, because he's in Sheboygan, he thinks if they transfer him to Manitowoc, that he would be able to have a Game Boy. Sorry, somebody is at my house picking something up, but now they just messaged me telling me they picked something up, so I don't need to go deal with that right now, even though my dogs are barking their heads off on it. So Brad had been in this jail for whatever reason, and so he's the one that has told Brendan, if you go here, you'll be able to have a Game Boy. So we get lots of calls, you'll see as we go on, where Brendan is obsessing on wanting to get transferred to Manitowoc just so he could play a Game Boy. Barb tells him her phone was shut off because her phone bill was too damn high. She told him that Travis's phone has been disconnected. She said her phone bill was over $1,000. Brendan said that Mike Halbach has said he's glad that Brendan didn't fire his lawyer, that they were all working together. He said that my attorney said Stephen will run out of money soon for his own attorneys. Brendan said his lawyer said he won't be moved unless he takes the plea bargain. So, see, this is another way they're trying to manipulate Brendan, that he really wants to go to Manitowoc because he wants that Game Boy. Because, that's like one of the biggest things in Brendan's life is video games. So, we'll let you go to Manitowoc if you take the plea bargain and say you were guilty. Barb says, if you didn't do nothing, don't take the plea. And she says, but you've buried yourself with your statements. You don't need to talk to them, but you do it anyhow. And then she said, do you like it in there? I'm still trying to figure out why you said all that stuff. They weren't supposed to talk to you on the 27th, so that would be February 27th. Brendan was arrested on March 1st. They weren't supposed to talk to you on the 27th because they didn't call me first, which that's not true. It is legal that you can take a child out of school without their parents' knowledge or consent and take them in for questioning. They called me around 2 to come and get you. She says, I wanted to go in there when you gave your statement, but they said it would be better if I didn't, and I should wait in the waiting room. And then she told him that he can only call once a week because her phone will get cut off again. So this is typical Barb ragging on Brendan, this 16, 17-year-old kid. You shoulda. No, Barb, you shoulda. You're telling Brendan he should have stood up to these cops when she herself, the adult, the parent, didn't. They told her it would be better if you don't go in there, so she didn't. She didn't fight for her kid, but then she wants to continually yell at Brendan that he shouldn't have said anything. Well, no, Barb, you should have been in that room, and you should have taken him right out of there. Charge him or let him go. Next call is to Barb again. Barb answers the phone crying. Brendan says, what's wrong? Barb says, nothing. Brendan says, why do you sound bad? And Barb says, nothing, don't worry about me. Brendan says, sounds like something happened, and he asked if it has to do with Scott. And she said, my life is going downhill and I can't take it. Brendan said, so here's Brendan changing the subject and going, I thought they were doing bail today. So I guess he had some hearing. And Barb says, guess they're going to wait. Brendan said he got a letter from Channel 5. Barb says, they think Stephen is making you get another attorney. Brendan says he doesn't talk to him. Barb says, I'm losing everybody. That's something that Barb says a lot of. She whines continually that her teenage sons aren't home hanging out with her. But I don't know in what world that teenage boys hang out at home all the time unless they're on video games and such with their friends. They're not hanging out with their parents, but that's Barb is always whining to her child who is in jail of poor her. Her 19 and 20-year-old sons aren't home hanging out with her. Brendan says, did you hear what date I got to be in there next? Meaning into court. And Barb said June 2nd, which was surprising because usually she doesn't know anything that's going on with this case. Brendan says, every time I call Grandma, she doesn't accept my call. Barb says, because her phone bill is too high because Steven calls all the time. Brendan says he's done the math and it's about $450 a month for a 15-minute call every day. And then Brendan says to his mom, I want to know what's wrong. Barb says, my family is going to shit. And then she says, it's just me and you 4 boys. And then we have what I have in my notes that I just write, ailment. So I don't even pay attention to this stuff anymore. So I don't know what the ailment is. But in so many calls, Brendan changes the subject to say something is medically wrong with him. And I assume it's because Mom doesn't ever seem to truly care about Brendan. So he's trying to get her to care by something's wrong with him. So this hurts. I've got this bump. I've got this is turning red, something. So he's always got some kind of ailment to try and rein her back into caring about him. I just have on here, Barb cries as hang up on her. So I think the call got disconnected, not that somebody hung up. Because the next call is Barb again, where she says to Brendan, I can hardly move. And so then Brendan goes into an ailment. And then Barb says she's not coming to visit tonight. She'll come on Tuesday instead of Wednesday then. She asks him, why are you calling? And Brendan says, because they didn't turn the phone off. So that's, she's questioning because the phones are always cut off at 7:30, I think it is. So he's calling past that time. So that's why she's saying, why are you calling? And he said they didn't turn the phone off. She said that tomorrow at 7 she'll be at Green Lake by Todd. I don't know what that means. Brendan asks her again. This is another thing he talks about all the time. He really wants his brother Brad to visit. Brad is somebody who takes his mind off of things. He enjoys his conversations with Brad and really wants Brad to visit. And so he asks his mom if Brad is coming up. And then he asks her about the fishing she did recently. And she just keeps saying owie at random times, so something's wrong with Barb. Owie, owie, owie. Then she says, do you want to talk to Blaine? And Brendan says, I don't know. And she puts Blaine on the phone. They talk about wrestling. And then when Barb comes back on the phone, Brendan asks, so Scott's not mad anymore? And Barb said no. And that's the extent of that call. I'm not even going to read. So like the next call, no one answered. I'm just going to completely skip that. You don't need to hear, take up the time for me to say on this call, nobody answered in this call. Cause there's also a lot of calls where it says insufficient funds, so Brendan is trying to make these phone calls, but he doesn't have any money to make them. So I'll just skip when that happens. Next call's to Barb. Brendan talks about wanting a Game Boy Advance. Barb says Kratz only thinks you'll move to Manitowoc if you take the plea bargain. What did you tell your attorney yesterday? Brendan said, I didn't say nothing. Barb said, did Steven do this? And this is another thing, so a lot of times it seems like we've heard this call before, but no, it's just the same shit, different day. So many calls, you have Barb questioning him again. Are they guilty? That almost makes you think at some point of, is she setting up her kid and trying to trick him into saying something since these calls are recorded? because he's answered all this before. Why do you keep asking him these things? So she said, did Steven do this? And Brendan said, not that I know of. And Barb said, how did you come up with all that shit then? And Brendan says, do I have to say all this again? I was nervous. And then he asks if Brad can come up and visit. Next call is to Barb again. Brendan asked, were 3 girls in court? And she said no. And then she says, can I ask you a question? That's a drinking comment right there. That's another thing that gets said all the time. Can I ask you a question? And then she said, what the hell was that today? 2 days prior? Meaning that she's thinking this thing with Teresa was planned 2 days prior. Brendan says, I don't know. Barb says, where are they getting it from? Brendan said, from me. Brendan said, they got it out of me, but it's not true. That's after they talked to me after the lie detector test. They wouldn't help me. Barb says, they're trying to bury your ass. Brendan said, I'm not going to get out. And Barb says, well, look at all that shit you're telling them. If you didn't do it, don't say it. Brendan says, there's a lot of stuff you don't know about me. Barb says, do you want to go to prison for life? And Brendan says, I'm telling you the truth. It's not true. I was nervous. And then Brendan said, I'm stupid. I can't help it. And Barb says, you're not stupid to me. Brendan said, what do you call a person who plays video games? Stupid. And then he asks her, what's my favorite sport? And Barb says, football or basketball. So it's kind of interesting there that Brendan was trying to quiz his mother to see if she knew him. And she doesn't. Next calls to Barb again. She's busy building a back deck. Then she says to Brendan, can I ask you a question? Which one is the truth? Brendan says, the one I told you. Barb says, which one was that? She says, some days I just want to take myself out. It's hard living here, not because of what went on. And then she complains that the other boys are never there. Brendan says, Steven wants 5 of 6 charges dropped. Sexual assault, murder, and the fire. He knows he had a fire. They talk about how Steven and Barb went and bought handcuffs together. Barb says, didn't I teach you right from wrong and not to lie? And look at what it did. Brendan said, they can use our calls against me. Barb wants him to write a letter to the judge. And then Brendan goes into an ailment discussion. Next calls to Barb again. She was on another call with Anjanette from the news. And then she says to Brendan, I got a question. Where did you clean up the garage? Brendan said, where he fixes cars. Not in the middle. Then he asks her, what does plaintiffs mean? Barb doesn't know. Then he says, there's a temporary restraining order and that all parties have to pay their own costs. So what he's talking about is the Hallbox filed suit against Steven and then also Brendan. Barb said the civil suit was all denied. She said, I have a question for you. Remember that Saturday, did you request Tom and Mark, that's Fassbender and Wiegert, come up by you? Brendan said, not that I know of. He said Mike came up. That would be this stupid check one of these boxes. I'm sorry for what I did. I'm not sorry for what I did. Michael Kelly. Mike came up, showed me a picture of a bullet with blood on it and the Pontiac. So again, trying to get planted with Brendan that there were bullets now used. Brendan says, can you call Marie and tell her I will call her? Next call to Barb. And she says, why are you calling my cell phone? And he said, because the other line was busy. Barb says, because somebody's on the internet. Remember that? The internet that Barb claims they didn't have. Brendan asked, who's there? That's also a question he asks every call, is that he just always wants to know who's home. But Barb says, I can't say. And she says, someone who can't have no contact with you. So it's assumed she's referring to Jody, because it was at that point the weird Jody stuff. Next calls to Barb again. Brendan says, why won't anyone answer the phone? Barb says, I don't know. I don't know why they don't want to answer. Then Brendan said, when I came home after the bonfire, I asked about your visit to the hospital. Then he tells her that his canteen was $9.53, and he tells her he doesn't know how to fill out a canteen order. As you can see from my notes then, these are lots of calls that nobody answers. So when we finally get a call that somebody answers, it's Barb. Brendan just starts on with an ailment. Brendan asks, did you call here yet? Because that's something he keeps wanting her to. He wants her to call because the things that he wants is he wants his friend Travis and Marie to be able to come visit. And the jail that he's in, it can only be immediate family. So he wants it asked if they can come visit, and then he wants to move to Manitowoc. So he keeps asking his mom to make these calls and find out about him being transferred to Manitowoc. And she, of course, her answer is no. Then Barb gets another call, so she takes that call and ends her call with Brendan. Next call to Barb again. And she says he can't get a Game Boy in jail. Brendan said there was stuff on the news about Steven. He's trying to get 5 of 6 charges dismissed. He doesn't want a jury from Manitowoc. And Barb says, neither do you. Barb says, I got a question for you. Did you get your toothbrush? Brendan said no. They think he's going to hurt himself with the toothbrush, so they won't let him have one. He says, you didn't ask about me getting moved? Barb says she'll ask soon. And then she tells him, speak up when I say something to you. So then Brendan starts talking about an ailment. Then Brendan says he wishes he can move to Manitowoc. Brad said if I move to Manitowoc, if plea bargain, because I can't stay there 20 years. Because that's what he's being told, that if he doesn't, that a plea bargain will get him 20 years. So then Barb says, let me ask you a question. Did you do this? Brendan says no. So she said, why would you take a plea bargain and say this asinine, which big word, asinine story? You can hear Scott bitching in the background, but you can't hear what he's saying. Brendan says, I wish I could go back and see if she left or not, meaning Teresa Halbach. and he wishes he could switch all this stuff, meaning the stuff that he said. And he wishes he didn't even go to the fire. Barb says Bobby says at 2:45 you weren't even home then. And then she tells him she doesn't know if she can come visit him this weekend. Next call is Barb. She's out cleaning the swimming pool. And then she tells him how they're putting on a new 20 by 20 deck with a 10-foot extension. Now Brendan says, I got a question for you. And Barb says, I don't even want to know what you wrote. I'm sure you'll tell the truth sooner or later. Brendan says, I told you the truth. Then Brendan talks about an ailment. Brendan says, sucks I'll miss 4th of July. It's my second favorite celebration. Then Brendan talks about another ailment. Barb says there's a new addition to the family. Brian has a new girlfriend. Next call ends up his brother Blaine answers the phone. And he says their mom went to town. So then there was really no conversation. Next call's to Barb. And he says, who's been on the phone or the internet? Because he was trying to call and couldn't get through. And Barb says probably Blaine. So again, there's the whole internet thing that she claims they didn't have internet. Barb says she wishes Brendan didn't talk to anyone. She says the attorney wants to come look at the land because Brendan had told him that she was putting in trees in a porch, which these calls are recorded, Barb. So, because, she's trying to blame Brendan for don't be telling them that she's spending money. She's got to keep crying poor. So don't be telling them I'm buying trees and putting up a new deck and I've got a swimming pool and all this. So now he's going to come look at the land. Because remember, he's assigned by the court because they're claiming they don't have any money. Barb says, did you tell your attorney the truth? Then Brendan tells her he got a haircut because that's another big obsession thing that Barb and Scott harp on him for all the time of wanting him to have his haircut. Barb says she doesn't like his haircut. So this haircut he had to have, now she doesn't like it. She says it looks all chopped. Next call's to Barb. There's a party at her house. It's the 4th of July. So the phone gets passed to Brian. No real conversation with his brother Brian. Then Barb tells Brendan she still hasn't made any of the calls that Brendan has asked her to do. Brendan says Stephen was on the news. They were talking about 9 motions, but Barb doesn't know anything about it because she doesn't watch. Brendan says he wants to give someone a gift when he gets out. He wants to give his blue Game Boy to Randy. That would be his cousin Randy. Because there's 3 kids in that family and they have 1 Game Boy and they fight over it. And so he's hoping if he gives his cousin Randy his Game Boy that they'll stop fighting. Brendan goes into an ailment. Candy and Earl did not come to the family 4th of July. Next calls to Barb. She said, Mike just tried calling me. Call again. He lost ya. The Mike she's referring to, Mike is Blaine's boss, and Brendan's worked for him before. And that's the guy that called looking for Blaine on that Halloween night. Brendan said, you said Bobby was that she couldn't come because Bobby was moving out. And she said, no, it's just hard for me to come up there. Then she said, why did you say the stuff you did? Brendan said, they made me say it. Barb says, then you should have said you didn't want to talk and wanted me there. No, Barb, you should have said you were going to be in there. Stop putting this on a 16-year-old kid with a low IQ. Brendan says, they said they talked to you. Barb says they lied. Next call is with Mike, Blaine's boss, and Blaine is with Mike. Brendan says, the Hallbacks are trying to get money out of us, so I'm supposed to write a letter to say why they shouldn't. Mike said that they're going after them for wrongful death. They want to tie up Steven's money. Brendan said he only has $13. Mike says, your mom should know what you tell people because it's in the press. I don't know what the truth is. Mike says, they're trying to make you look guilty. They will act like your friend. I don't know what you did or didn't do. I did call you on that day. Not on my Sprint phone, so there's no record. I called you around 6 p.m. that day. You told me how Blaine looked, meaning in his costume, for Halloween. I wouldn't believe you committed an act because of how good you talked to me. He says attorney should be present or his mom. They will try to get you to say things. You got to tell the truth. I'm very sorry this happened to you. Can we bring you some magazines? And then he tells them, make sure your hair is washed and you look like a clean kid. They're using dirty pics of you. And then he said, I'd like to come talk to you. But they said that his friends can't come there. He says he talked to Len Kaczynski. I'll tell the court the conversation we had that night. Brendan said, Blaine knows I didn't go by Steven. Mike says, I don't know why you said those things if it didn't happen. And then the phone got cut off. Next call is to Barb. Brendan said, I talked to Mike a little and it got disconnected again. They talked about the Hallbacks trying to get the money. Brendan says he's still trying to find Travis. Barb tells him to call Earl. Brendan says that Blaine can use the GameStop card that Brendan got as a gift. Barb says, this is like taking a life, them taking you away from me. And then she's got her crying voice. Brendan says, Kratz is going to call you. Barb says, I just wish you wouldn't have said all that shit. Then Mom wouldn't be going through all this shit now. She always refers to herself in third person. Brendan said, now that Bobby has moved, when Bobby moves out, are you going to keep the computer in there? Meaning in Bobby's room? And then Barb says, I blame all this shit on Mark and Tom. Now we've got a whole lot of people not answering his calls. There's a voicemail to Justin. Justin is a friend of Travis's because at this point, it's Brendan hasn't talked to Travis in forever and he can't find him and he's like desperate to talk to him. So he leaves a voicemail with Justin saying, ask Travis if he has his cell phone. He hasn't talked to him in 2 months. Then another call is Barb's voicemail. Then another call is to Barb's voicemail again, where he tells him that he'll call her tomorrow at 6:30 or 6:45. The next call, I don't know who this is to. I don't have written who it was. Maybe as I read what the conversation was, I'll remember who it was. It's Brendan says, I tried to call my mom, but she won't answer. He said it was Scott's birthday yesterday and Brian's is tomorrow. There's a guy in the background and says, we got to get out of here. Brendan says he read 6 books, 238 pages. Um, the person says the more reading you do, the better speller you'll be. Brendan says he can't talk to Marie. Okay, so it's Candy. That's who he was talking to, because so Candy is Marie's mother, Earl's wife, and she says we felt it better. She didn't use up her minutes on calls with Brendan, and they also didn't want her pulled into court for saying something on these calls that are recorded. She said they feel it's best for Marie not to get involved. When he finally gets a hold of Barb, because there's more calls where nobody's answering or he gets voicemail, one of which he leaves a voicemail for his mom saying, I thought you were going to have your phone on. So when he finally talks to his mom, he says, are you still fishing? And she said, no. We were at the Derby. They caught 26 fish. The biggest was 18 pounds. Brendan says, they said the only way I would move closer is if I take the plea bargain. He says the letter he wrote the judge will be sealed and in the press. Brendan talks about wanting a Game Boy. Barb says Scott's telling her she has thunder thighs and a big ass. And she said he's going to get a slap. And then Scott says, I got big balls. Brendan said, did you get Cindy's number? Cindy is Travis's mother. Barb says, not yet. Okay, so, Travis is his best friend. He hasn't spoken to her, to him in 2 months. He's desperate to talk to him, and his mom isn't helping or explaining to him that Travis no longer wants to talk to Brendan. She's just letting him do this constant wanting to find Travis. Brendan says, all you have to do is stop by their house. And then he asks if he can call her tomorrow. Next call is to Barb. Brendan said they found a boy's body in Lake Michigan. Barb says she's been trying to call Justin, but there's no answer. Brendan says he finished 2 books last night. And then Barb says, are you coming home? Brendan says, I hope so. I miss everything. And then Brendan says, I'll tell you a secret. Ever since Mousy died, you buried her by the fence, right? That's one of the cats. And so he says he used to go and sit there by where Mousy was buried. That's his secret. Next calls to Barb. She asks him how much does he have in his account. And then Scott asks if they can borrow some as he's got more than they got. He thinks he's being funny. Brendan says, did you call up here? And Barb says, I haven't had a chance yet. Brendan wants to move closer and get a Game Boy. And then Barb says, have you written the letter? Asking to move closer. Next call, Barb still hasn't called an attorney. Tells Brendan that Brad's girlfriend is not pregnant and that Brad's girlfriend lied, claiming she was pregnant. Next calls to Barb. He asks her if she watched the news. Nope. And Brendan's like, did you see what they said about me? And Barb says that you have people who say where you were, meaning that there were people on the news that were saying they knew Brendan didn't do this. Next call, Barb again. She said there's a scheduled conference in the judge's room for the wrongful death suit. Brendan said, they said if I write a letter, they might accept it. Barb says, did you say why, did you say, why should you sue us when I didn't do it? Brendan said, they probably don't believe me anyhow. Barb says, I don't care if we are being taped or not. I want to know who put this in your head. Brendan said, Mark and Tom. They would ask me a question, and I say it never happened, and they say I was lying. And he says, and that's what they did to him up north too. Barb said, you will be going up on the stand. And she said, I don't need you going to prison for something you didn't do. There's a lot of stuff that don't make sense. She said, when Blaine and I met the two investigators in November on the 15th, she said Blaine was not home all the time because, oh, no, this is her now saying Blaine's not home all the time because they took his brother away. So, always trying to make Brendan feel bad that she's alone. Her sons aren't there hanging out with her. Again, her 17-year-old kid is not home hanging out with her, and the reason he's not home is because Brendan's not there. Brendan is again asking her to get Travis's number for him so he can talk to Travis. Next calls to Barb. Brendan said, did you talk to my attorney? And she said no. And she said she can't talk to him today because it's Saturday. And she says, and I'm to tell him what? And Brendan says, I want to see if he did the stuff yet. And then to ask a guard about my glasses and Game Boy because he's having a hard time seeing because he doesn't have his glasses. And, of course, he wants a Game Boy. He has court August 31st for the wrongful death. Barb says she's watching court TV right now. She says he needs to get the Game Boy out of his brain. Brendan says, but it's boring and he has nothing to read now. Brendan wants her to call his attorney. Barb says she'll do it on Monday. Brendan says, then call his house now. And Barb says, I don't want him mad at me. Brendan says, ask him about the Game Boy. Next calls to Barb. She answers in her crying voice. And he asks her, when are you coming up? And she says, not feeling too good. She said she went to the doctor yesterday. She's not supposed to drive because she's taking pills. And Brendan says, so she's not going to work? He asks if she watched the news. Barb says he should finish with his lawyer. Brendan says, you can't come up on Saturday? And she says, I'll come up. Then she tells Brendan that she changed her phone number. She says she changed it because Scott's brother keeps texting her that he wants her and loves her. She said Blaine got Cindy's number for him. Then she tells Brendan she has a kidney stone. She said his attorney will be talking to her on Sunday that he's coming to the house. So, remember just this last call? It's Saturday. I'm not going to talk to your lawyer on a Saturday. But here it is. She's saying he's coming to her house on a Sunday. Brendan said, did you ask about the Game Boy? Barb says, I don't remember. Because she's in too much pain. Brendan asked to talk to Blaine. Barb says she's in pain from all the stress. Then Brendan goes into an ailment. Barb says, if you want, you can call back, meaning the 15 minutes were just about up. So she's saying he can call her right back. She says because, she hasn't talked to him in a while. She says because you haven't called in a while, but that's not true. You can see all those where he's made calls and nobody's answering his calls. So he calls, they just don't answer. So next calls to Barb. Brendan says, does Scott know about his brother? Brendan says, yes, he don't like it. Brendan says it's been a month since he's talked to Carla. He's going to call this week. He said he tried to call last week and they didn't answer. Barb says they're getting married in October. Brendan said he would babysit for free when they went on their honeymoon. Barb said Sean and Katie are not together anymore. So Sean is Scott's brother that she's talking about. Um, Barb says, I'll be up Sunday with your dad. I should be feeling better by then. I'm on painkillers and 2 other pills. They make me sleepy and I'm not supposed to drive. She says she hasn't gone anywhere in the last couple days, and if she did, Scott drove her. She said, did attorney have someone with you when investigators were with you? Brendan said, just a lie detector guy. Barb says, you don't talk to the investigators no more. You shouldn't have to begin with, or you wouldn't be there. They lie. Brendan said on March 1st, they took him to Manitowoc. They said they knew the story. How would they know? Barb said they made it up or had someone do it and try to have him take the blame. Brendan says, how would they know that he helped? There were no fingerprints. Barb says nothing except for his pants. That even where you cleaned in the garage isn't where it was. Brendan says, I don't know if we cleaned on that day or not. Barb says, when court comes and he's on the stand, you tell the truth. Brendan said, they took me at lunchtime from school and he wasn't given any food. Barb says, tell Blaine, I can't read my own writing there. Oh, tell Blaine to tell Justin that I'll call. All right, next calls Barb. He said, I called the numbers you gave me. For Justin's, it didn't even ring. And then he asked, where are you? And Barb said, Family Dollar. Barb says, they don't have a house phone, meaning Justin doesn't have a house phone. Brendan said, why do you have to take pills? Or when do you have to take pills? And Barb said, at 9 p.m. Brendan talks about wanting a Game Boy. Barb tells him she'll be at court on Friday. Next calls to Barb. Or he talks to Barb, and Barb says, why are you calling Carla? Brendan said, you're at Carla's, but you couldn't make it up here? Blaine went to wrestling with their dad. Barb said, your attorney is here right now. Would you like to talk to him? Brendan said no. Brendan said, there's stuff on the news today. He think he might need another haircut. Brendan said he told his dad about Game Boy, and his dad said he would pay for some of it. Barb says, what's the change? He wasn't paying for nothing otherwise. Then Len Kaczynski gets on the phone. Brendan says, there's the 2 things that he wants, and Len says, I'll keep bugging them. You will get to wear civilian clothes in court. And he asks him if his waist is bigger or smaller. Brendan says he thinks it's the same. Brendan asks Len what he thinks of his cat since Len's at his house. Barb tells him to see if he can get a haircut by Friday. Brendan says, bad news. The bumps are in a different place, because now we're going to discuss an ailment. Barb says she's not giving her new cell phone number to Carla. And then she said, why should she stay home if nobody else is at her house? Next calls to Barb. She says, how come you didn't tell Mom that? Brendan says, it's not true. They said they wouldn't let me go because I was lying. I said what they said. They said someone had a gun. They asked if he used it to kill her. They found gun shells. Barb says she's coming to visit tomorrow. She says Bobby wants to come. Barb says, you never saw her or had sex with her? Brendan says no. Brendan says, "Did you tell Emily I love her?" The girl he had been dating. Barb says, "We talked for a while. She didn't say too much." Barb says, "Scott misses you too." Brendan talks about an ailment. Barb says, "They said you sliced her throat." Brendan says, "No." Brendan says, "What does Stephen think about this?" Barb says, "He said he didn't do it." Brendan said, "They said they wouldn't let me go till they got the real story. They said they had more evidence that someone used something on her, like the gun and the chains." Next call is to Travis. So this may be where we now go to older calls. Brendan tells him none of that stuff happened. Travis said, "You said it did." Brendan said, "I said I didn't know." Next calls to Barb. She tells him, "We are almost there. It's just me and Bobby." Brendan says, "That's it?" And then he says, "When is Dad coming next?" Barb says, "I don't know." Brendan says, "Does my attorney wear glasses?" Barb says, "I don't know. I never met him." So this is obviously before the call we just had when he was at the house. Brendan wants to talk to Emily. Her mom is getting divorced, and the mom thinks that Brendan could cost her custody of the kids, so Emily's mom won't let Emily talk to Brendan. But Barb says he can call her on Monday because Emily's mom is gone. Next calls to Travis. Brendan asks about Emily, and Travis says she doesn't know if she wants to go out with you because she doesn't think you'll ever get out. Travis said, "You can't call every day because my mom can't afford it." Next calls to Barb. Brendan says, "I'm pissed off. Travis told me Emily don't want to be with me anymore because she thinks I'm not going to get out. She just wants to be friends." Barb says, "Tell your attorney the truth." Brendan said, "I just want to come home." Barb says, "We will find out Friday." Brendan says he doesn't want an ankle monitor. And also, he doesn't want to have to go to school during the week, but then have to go back to jail on weekends. Next calls to Barb. Asked to talk to Blaine. Oh, so she said that Blaine, Bobby, and Chuck are there. You want to talk to one of them. So he said Blaine. He tells Blaine about Emily. Then Brendan asks Barb if he talked to Marie. He asked about the money she's made because she's been making stuff and selling them to give the money for Brendan for his canteen and such. Brendan said they raised Stephen's bail to $2 million. Barb says, "I don't watch the news." Brendan says, "I should have listened to Travis that day. He told me not to go." Barb says, "They're not supposed to talk to you without me or an attorney." That's not true. Barb says, "Want to talk to Chuck?" Brendan says, "Not today." Barb says, "You want to talk to Bobby?" Brendan says, "Doesn't matter. I'll see you tomorrow." Barb says, "Scott wants to move in. Is that okay with you?" Brendan says, "Yeah." She said, "Sean will live at Scott's." Brendan says he misses Jody. Next calls to Travis. Brendan says court should start around 1:30. Brendan says, "As long as I got love from my family, that's all I need." Next call to Barb. Oh, Blaine was on the internet that she didn't have. Brendan said, "Did you talk to my attorney?" Barb says no. Barb says, "Do you like this attorney?" Brendan says, "I don't know much except his favorite animal is the same as mine." Barb says, "This is as hard for me as it is for you. I don't want to go to work." Brendan said, "You can go wherever you want. I can't." Good for you, Brendan. Barb says, you shouldn't have wrote that you shouldn't have wrote what they wanted you to write. They never called me and asked if they can talk to you. They don't have to, Barb. And when you went there, you should have gone in that room. Next calls to Barb. Brendan says he still doesn't have a toothbrush, so he used his nails to scratch his teeth to try and clean them. He's going to ask for new socks because these are getting smelly. He said they allow him to change his boxers every day. They give him new clothes weekly. Mike is with Barb and the call is terminated. Next call is Barb and Mike is with her still. He says he will get Brendan books and magazines, but they can't send them to him. Mike says, I talked to you that night. Why did you sign that paper? Brendan says, I don't know. They said I had to. Mike says, you didn't. Tell your attorney. And Brendan says, Mark made me write it. And Mike says, it had such detail. And then he tells Brendan he loves him. Brendan talks about an ailment. Next call is Barb. They talk about the court hearing. Barb says, you seen her and he made you clean it up. Kayla says that too. You had nothing to do with it? Brendan says, Kayla lies. Barb says, I know Kayla likes to lie. Barb says, they want to give you life. Brendan said they strip searched him after court. Barb talks about being on the internet that they don't have. Barb says, if you didn't do it, why did you give that statement? Brendan says, I didn't. I wrote it. Next calls to Barb. She says, what paper did you sign in the courtroom? Brendan says, I don't know. He thinks it's change of venue. Brendan then has to go through his story with his mom again. Barb says, what time did you come home? Brendan said 9 or 9:30. He said that she came home at 8, right? Barb said she left at 5:10 and was back by 8. She said, did you get a letter from Kayla? Brendan says no. Barb bitches that his hair looked greasy. And so Brendan talks about an ailment. Then Brendan says he wants to see Brad. Next calls to Travis. Brendan says, what's this I'm hearing? That you and Kayla said something? Travis says he's got no clue. Brendan said, my mom said you said something about the case. Next calls with Dolores. She asked, how are you? She says, it's a rough place to be in. I wish you both were out. Then Jody gets on the phone. She asks him about having to do homework in crayon. Jody offered to find Alan for Brendan to talk to. Dolores says there's no reason to put Alan on the phone with Brendan because Alan would never be able to hear Brendan on the phone. Brendan said, would he sell land to get me out? Jody says she will ask Alan and tell Barb so Barb can tell Brendan. Brendan asked her how Stephen is. Jody said, did you tell them did you tell his lawyer that Fassbender and Wiegert called him a fucking liar? Then Dolores tells him it's a cash bond. Grandpa won't sell land for no one. The kids would have nowhere to work. You have to tell your lawyers all that stuff. And she said, your ma should get another lawyer because this one don't look like much. She said, we want you both out. She said, Stephen can talk as long as he wants, but she can't afford the bill. She said after 4 days, her phone bill was $250. Next calls to Barb. She says, what's wrong? Why do you seem so down? Brendan says, if you watch the news, you would know. The Hallbacks are suing Stephen. He said they don't want Stephen to pay a lawyer. He asked her if she talked to Jody. Barb says, I thought you were going to talk to Grandpa. Brendan said, I asked Jody. She put Grandma on, and she said they wouldn't because they would starve. Barb says, they don't have to sell, just put up property. Brendan said, how much property do you have? Barb says, 1 acre. I don't have enough. Brendan says, can they take cars in for money like they've done before? Barb says, Grandma doesn't talk to me. Brendan says, then why does she care about me? Barb says, you're her grandson, but I don't get treated like a daughter. Next calls to Barb. Brendan talks about his call with Jody. Barb says Blaine lost his job because of this, and that she almost lost her job too. Brendan says, did she hire the lawyer or the state? Barb said the state. Brendan said there's a kid in there who says then that's why his lawyer's not doing anything, because he's from the state. He says he wants to talk to Blaine. And then when Blaine gets on the phone, they tell each other they miss each other. Blaine says he lost his job because they don't trust him or Bobby. Next calls to Barb. She tells him she can't come tomorrow. She's got to go to Manitowoc to see an attorney. Her, Chuck, and Jody are going. Brendan says, when was the last time that she talked to Stephen? And Barb said today. Then she put Blaine on the phone. Nothing of importance is said. Next calls with Travis. Travis tells him, I'm whacking off, and asks him if he ever whacks off in prison. Hold, please. Travis asks if he's ever gotten ass raped by the guards. Travis wants to put his buddy Justin on the phone. Brendan doesn't really want to talk to Justin, says Justin has talked shit about him. Travis tells Brendan he's gone by since Brendan went to jail. Next call is with Barb. She tells him that he can call Emily today. And then she says, keep it easy on Mom on phone calls or I can't afford them. Then she whines and says all her kids left her and took him away from her too. So Brendan talks about an ailment. Next call is with Travis. And he also tells her you can call Emily. Brendan goes over the timeline with Travis that we've heard a million times. And then he tells them the story we've heard before of the family going to a birthday party at Tom Yonda's family's house. Brendan didn't want to go because that family didn't come to his birthday party, so he didn't want to go to their birthday party. And so then Stephen was trying to force him into the car, and Brendan took off running. He tells Travis that Scott is moving in, and then Travis says how many dads you got, and then Travis is saying that Brendan has had 4 dads because Travis counts himself as one of his dads. Next calls with Barb. He tells her that he can't call Emily because he's not getting his calling cards today. Barb tells him to call Grandpa tomorrow, see if he will accept it. Brendan says, ask the attorney when he's taking the lie detector. And then he asks if the lie detector says he's telling the truth, will he get out that day? Barb is coming up with excuses on why she might not be coming to see him. She says, Bobby's Blazer doesn't have any brakes. Brendan talks about an ailment. Brendan says, I'm lonely up here. Barb says, I'll ask Grandpa tomorrow. Barb says she doesn't talk to Jody. Because Brendan had said tell Jody that he says hi. Barb says, call Jody yourself. Next calls to Barb. She said, thought you were going to call them today. Brendan said, I couldn't. They got him up at 10 and he had to do homework and the phones weren't on. So this is again her pushing him to call his grandpa, and he's not comfortable and doesn't want to do it. Barb says they didn't say anything to her. They were just being assholes. Barb says, why didn't you have to leave when I needed you? What she's meaning by that is she's cleaning her closet to make space for Scott to move in. So she's whining that she's having to clean her own closet by herself and Brendan's not there to clean her closet for her. Brendan says it's Mark and Thomas's fault. They promised I'd come back. They told a lie. Next call was to Travis, but there's nothing to talk about. Then next call is to Travis again. Brendan tells him my grandpa won't give the up the land or the yard because it's the only way the family makes money for food. Next calls to Barb. She says she won't know anything till Tuesday. She will call his attorney. She needs him to write a note to give permission for the lawyer to talk to her about the case. Then she nags him about getting his calling cards because Barb seems to be under the impression that when you want something in jail, you say you want it and you just get it. So it's like, why don't you have your calling cards? Tell them you want it. You want your haircut. Tell them you want a haircut. Tell them you want this because that's the way jail and prison works. You know, you're a guest and they're, your wish is their command. She asks if he's okay. Brendan asks if Scott has moved in already. Barb says not yet. They still have to get everything situated with his landlord. She asks if he would like to talk to Scott. He says no. She says, you seem bummed out. Scott gets on the phone. They make small talk. To his credit, Scott did ask him a whole lot of questions. That you should be asking a kid that's stuck in jail. What are you eating? How's the food? What are you reading? Whatever you can ask. So Scott actually seemed to be taking an interest in asking these questions. Scott tells him, hang in there, kid. We're still supporting you. Brendan tells his mom when she gets back on the phone that Travis keeps joking about how many fathers he has. Next call, Scott answers. They make small talk. Scott says, hang in there, bud. Then Barb gets on the phone. She says, you filled out a paper for the calling cards? Brendan said no. She says, you have to fill out a paper. And he says, a guard in there said he was writing it in the book. Okay, sorry. Scott is in the background bitching, saying Brendan can't look like a gangbanger and needs to get his hair cut. Then Barb bitches about her boys not being home. When they end the call, Brendan tells Barb to tell Scott he loves him too. Next calls to Travis, nothing of note. Then call with Barb. She says, I got to do some talking on Tuesday. Brendan says, if Grandpa do that, do I have to wait till next court date to get out? Barb says she's sure something needs to be filed in court. Then she talks about a haircut. Brendan asks her if she's asked if his best friend and Marie can come up. She hasn't. Brendan talks about an ailment. Brendan says, Grandma watches the news every time. I'm sure that's a little thing on, oh, look, Dolores is always watching the news for her son's case, but Barb never watches to find out anything on Brendan's. Barb says, I can't tell you what Grandma does. Brendan says Hallbachs are suing Stephen. They don't want him spending money on attorneys or bail. Then the last call we listened to today was him calling Travis, but Travis wasn't home. So that's where we left off. So we have listened to 399 calls out of around, I guess there's like 450-ish, and everybody's pressing 4. So that's where we're all at on the calls. These reviews, if you go into the videos here on Stephen Avery Project, you can read the last reviews we've done, the other 2 that summarize all the calls. Or like I said at the beginning, if you want to hear them for yourself, we listen to them in MAM Gossip. MAM Gossip is a closed group, and that's where we get into more of the nitty gritty of the case, the drama that surrounds it, and we also discuss other cases in there. Stephen Avery Project, we try to keep only about the case and not the bullshit. And a lot of the people who come to Stephen Avery Project don't want to hear about any other cases. They only want to hear about Stephen and Brendan. So that's why MAM Gossip, we can talk about any case we want in there. Really, our strictest rule is, and the same thing goes for here on Stephen Avery Project, is we know Stephen and Brendan are innocent. We are not going to debate guilt or innocence. They are innocent. So guilters, be gone with you. I have no need to debate you. Don't care. The family may like to hang out with guilters. That's not me. I have no interest in people who think they're guilty. So there's plenty of other places you can go to for that. On Stephen Avery Project and MAM Gossip, we believe in their innocence, and that's all we're going to discuss. There's many different theories, many different, those can all be discussed on what actually happened to Teresa Halbach. Is she dead? Is she alive? Is it law enforcement? Is it Bobby? Is it Ryan Hilgas? All that. You're free to discuss all those theories. Just they are innocent. Bryce and Kat. And let's not forget about food talk. Yeah, we get off topic a lot and talk a lot about food. So, MAM Gossip is more fun because we get goofy and stupid. So, and we've got a team of moderators who try and watch what goes on in there. Like we've got a thread today that I know, I haven't read it myself personally, but I know it got ugly on people's being on either side of that topic. So again, they can have their own opinion, but you can't attack each other. Because something that I always give as my example that we can fight over in gossip is staircase guy is guilty and it's not an owl. Come on, we can fight. See, I don't think everybody's innocent. Staircase guy is guilty. And V made biscotti. Oh, baked biscotti. What time is it here? It's almost 7 p.m. here in Chicagoland. So the next time I'll be doing a Facebook Live. All right, Catherine. I can try and see. I haven't really done any of the stuff in gossip, so it would be one of the other moderators that removed you. So I'll see. If Christopher's been the one that's been doing most of the work as of lately in MAM Gossip. So the next time I'm scheduled to go live in Gossip is on Wednesday. tentatively scheduled for 4 p.m. Central Time, Chicago time. But if I don't have to work that day, then I go earlier at 2. Um, Tina's asked, is he getting out? Just joined. No, Stephen and Brendan, neither one is anywhere near getting out. Brendan has a much tougher road than than Stephen does. Brendan needs the real killer to be proven guilty or the governor to let him out. And in Stephen's case, we're waiting on the court's response to the latest filing, and there's no time limit. So that's where we're at. As soon as we get any decisions, we get it posted immediately. As soon as we can get it, it goes on Stephen Avery Project. And I also go live and we read the decisions. So if if there's any decision on Stephen's case, we go live that day as soon as we can. So it's just a waiting game. It's really sucky. Our system here in the states are awful. So we're just waiting. Kathleen has said it typically takes her, I'm really bad with numbers. Hasn't she said it typically takes her like 13 years to get somebody out? And so she's only she took Stephen's case in 2016? So she's only had Stephen's case for 4 years. And she says it's typically 13 years. It shouldn't be like that. Bryce. And so there's so many. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not basically a lawyer. I don't pretend to be a lawyer or know anything about the law. But things stop the clock, and you're only allowed to submit this. And then if that doesn't go anywhere, then you got to start back from the beginning and go through these steps again. And it goes from here. And then, so you submit something and then you have to wait for the state to respond. And then after the state responds, then you got to wait for the court. But then it's, this constant back and forth that takes forever. It takes nothing to put somebody away and takes them forever to get them back out. It's really sad. And Dolores and Alan are not young people. Every day, what's the saying? Every day is another day closer to death, right? We're all dying. Your clock is all, but they're older people. And, so you're robbing Stephen of another day with his mom, being free, that he has lost so much of his life. The first time he was in prison for 18 years before he got out, before that one was overturned. And he lost all his children and his wife. So, and then he was out for 2 years, had a girlfriend. Now, let's not get into how awful Jody is, but that was his girlfriend. They were in love. And he loses his girlfriend and his chance at $36 million for what has been proven to be a wrongful conviction. Loses it all. He was 22 when they took him the first time. Brendan's taken when he's 16. He has never been able to be a free adult. Didn't get to have a driver's license. go to a school dance, fall in love. Brendan's 30 years old. He could have had his own family. All this has been stolen from them. And time's just ticking away. It's horrible. I mean, and this is Stephen Avery Project, so we talk about their cases, but there's so many more. How many people are in prison for crimes they didn't commit? How many people have been forced to confess for something they didn't do? You don't have to be low IQ to be tricked by trained professionals who keep you in a tiny room for hours on end. Brendan was no match for them. No match. Brendan was Stephen's alibi. They needed to get rid of Stephen. They need to get rid of that $36 million. So they needed Brendan to say Stephen did something. And then Brendan gets tripped up in the whole thing because he's not understanding what they're trying to get him to say. What happened to her head, Brendan? Punched her? What else? Cut her hair? What else? Be honest. Cut her throat? I'm just going to come out and say it. Who shot her in the head? Stephen. Such a miscarriage of justice. So, all right. I'm going to leave you with that. If you want to watch, as I said, oh gosh, you guys are still talking about the owl. It's not an owl. It's not a tuma. If you want to watch or listen to the calls, like I said, join MAM Gossip. And you want to watch our next live, we are scheduled for Wednesday around either 2 or 4 p.m. Central. I get an idea that morning if I'm working or what, when I'll go, and we make a post in Gossip to try and give people the heads up. I try to do it as early as I can since we do have people all around the world in the different time zones that, could be so late for them. So I try to come up with a, good time for everybody to be on. So in the meantime, thank you everybody for joining us here on Stephen Avery Project. Thank you for being supporters of Stephen and Brendan. And we will keep you up to date as soon as anything else develops in their cases. So have a good night, and I will see you all on Wednesday.